Hi, Fellowship Denver. I'm Jill Anschutz. I'm the deacon of Serve Denver, which is our church's approach to serving the city through partnerships with nonprofits. For today's devotion, I want to start by sharing a quote that means a lot to me. It's attributed to Theodore Roosevelt. And he said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." Comparison is a terrible habit for me, and it's something that is showing up a lot during quarantine. Let me give you two examples. The joy of a Zoom call happy hour with friends just completely evaporates if I start comparing myself and what I look like on the screen to the other video callers instead of focusing on the chance to connect. And I'm quarantined at home with my husband, and I find my mind wandering and comparing our relationship to other marriages. And the joy that I get from spending time with my husband just completely dissipates if I start thinking things like, well, this other couple, they connect more easily, or they have more in common, or I wish our family looked like that family and that we had kids at that stage in life. I also have discovered something about comparison that's shown up for me in this season of quarantine, which is I think I use comparison as a way to justify feelings of anxiousness or fear about the future. So I find myself comparing my situation to other situations, and I'm pointing out what I think is missing or what I don't have that I think that I need. And I convince myself that being fearful is justified because of that missing piece. So for me, comparison robs me of joy, and I use it to justify ways of thinking and acting that are totally inconsistent with what Jesus has called me to do. So I've been looking at a concept in the Bible that I think can be an antidote to comparison. And it first appears in Exodus and Leviticus. When Moses is leading the Israelites, they've escaped slavery in Egypt. They're preparing for the promised land, but they're in the wilderness. And God tells them that they need to celebrate a series of feasts every year. And one of those feasts is called the Firstfruits Festival. And there's a great description of it in Exodus 23. And the purpose of the festival is for the Israelites to bring the first and best portions of the harvest to God as an offering. In asking his agrarian people to bring the literal first fruits of the harvest to the temple, God is asking them to take a huge step of faith. So let's say that you're a shepherd and you shear your sheep for the first time of the season. Instead of using that wool to make new clothes for yourself or to sell it in the market and buy something else that you need, God is asking you to bring that wool as a gift to him. And I think it's an act of faith in two different dimensions. The first dimension is that it demonstrates that you believe that God is the owner of the harvest. It really belongs to him in the first place. And by giving a portion of it back to him, even though your kids need new sweaters and you need new wool socks, you've outgrown them and you've worn them out, it demonstrates that you know God knows your need and that it all belongs to him anyway. And the second dimension is that the first fruits giver believes that this is just the beginning of the harvest, that there is going to be more that follows. And so it's an act of faith that says, I believe God will also provide for me into the future. When we're gathered together on Sundays after worship and the sermon and communion, Hunter or Dave introduces the offering, and they don't use the phrase first fruits, but it's the same concept, and they usually say something like, this is a time of offering where we know that everything we have comes from God, and so this is a chance to give back a portion of that to God. The concept of first fruits is also part of the New Testament as well. James 1:18 says, God chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. So James is saying that our faith is actually the first fruits of the harvest, of the redeeming and renewing that God is accomplishing throughout the whole world, that one day will come to its fullness in a new heavens and a new earth. Paul also uses this concept In 1 Corinthians 15:20, he ties it to the resurrection, which we just celebrated at Easter. He says, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep." So Christ's resurrection is just the first resurrection of all believers who will one day be resurrected. So the giving of firstfruits is an antidote to comparing yourself with your neighbor and worrying about what you don't have. Because giving acknowledges that everything we have comes from God and belongs to Him. He knows us and He knows our needs, and we can believe and trust that He will care for us into the future. So I encourage you to reflect on where you might have allowed comparison to steal your joy or to justify worry and anxiety. Is there something that God has already given to you that you can give away as an act of faith that praises God for His provision and demonstrates that you are trusting Him to provide for you into the future during this season of quarantine?